Today, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, together with other EU foreign ministers, is participating in the Foreign Affairs Council held in Luxembourg. The war in Ukraine is at the top of the agenda. To talk about the latest from Luxembourg, we're joined by Benjamin Tallis, Senior Research Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Hello, sir, and thanks for joining us on TVP World.
Good afternoon. Nice to be back with you.
Now, one of the hottest topics at the meeting will be the Russian assets transferred to Ukraine, part of the $50 billion loan backed by frozen Russian assets, as the first $1.5 billion or 1.2 billion euros is set to be transferred next week. Is this plan set in stone? Can Hungary no longer block it?
I think it's unlikely that Hungary would block it. There is a chance, but having actually to step back from some of the decisions that were made in this regard earlier in the process, Hungary has pretty much lost its right to intervene there, which is something that Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, said this morning. I think the bigger issue, though, with the assets is that while this is a good step on the way, it's actually quite a complicated way to avoid doing what is the right thing, which would be seizing all of the Russian assets.
Well, concerning that, do you think this is perhaps a good first step, and that seizing all the assets seems to be like a very complicated matter as well? Perhaps that just is going to take a bit more time.
Well, it might take a bit more time, but I think anyone who has Europe's security interest at heart, anyone who wants to show Russia that we have the resolve to actually win, and who also wants to fund Ukraine's victory, has to absolutely make sure that this is only a step. This is a step on the way, rather than an alternative to seizing the full amount of Russian assets, which it's worth reiterating is legal, economically viable, and the big issue is actually political will. So while this is a good step, it's not enough, and it can't become an alternative.
Speaking of political will, at today's Foreign Affairs Council in Luxembourg, EU foreign ministers formally adopted the 14th package of sanctions hitting Russia's gas exports. Now, the new restrictions bans transshipments through EU ports of LNG, to include a clause also allowing Sweden and Finland to cancel some of their LNG contracts. Germany was a holdout until the end. What, first of all, were the major concerns that Germany had concerning this 14th package of sanctions?
Well, I think it sort of fits with the general picture of Olaf Scholz's rather hesitant approach to the war in general and to not punishing Russia too much. Scholz has yet to commit to winning the war, even though, interestingly, one of his party members today, Manuela Schwesig, who's the minister-president of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where the Nord Stream 2 pipeline came in, actually said in Kiev that Ukraine should win the war. So she's actually even ahead of the chancellor at the moment. But this hesitancy, and again, not punishing Russia too much, not precluding future relations with Russia, seems to lie underneath the issue of the gas here. But it's worth bearing in mind that this hasn't banned all imports of Russian gas to the EU, and at various times in the last 2 years, Russian gas has continued to actually be of a higher value imported to the EU than that, for example, from the US.
It's exactly my next question, is that Germany takes much of its LNG. Well, no, that means we're on the right track, sir. Well, Germany takes just about as much LNG from Russia as it does the United States. Why this difference, and what is it going to take for Germany to change this paradigm?
Well, it's going to take political will. As you mentioned before, this is the key in this. If you actually want to make that change and make that break, you'll do it. And don't forget that Germany only got off non-liquid Russian gas when Russia turned off the tap. So this really is a question of how Germany's government and how its elites see their future relations with Russia, how they see the competitiveness of their business model, the reliance on that energy source, and the failure to find credible alternatives that meet geopolitical but also ecological and economic criteria. And that all comes down to a lack of strategic thinking and strategic culture in Berlin.
Right. Do you think Olaf Scholz is currently concerned about a Russian defeat and what that would look like? Is that something that scares him?
Oh, very much so. Yes, this has been a fear that has haunted German policy on this issue since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And I think it's misplaced, but nonetheless, it is certainly there. So as an analyst describing what is the issue here, I think that fear is real, and the fear comes from the notion that it might create instability, and it might create instability in a country that is armed with nuclear weapons. So there is a non-zero chance that would happen. It's something you have to be able to analyze and to calculate the risk of. But what that fear dominating decision making does is ignore the very real risks of Russia winning, or even of Russia being rewarded through a ceasefire, through a negotiated solution that would allow it to keep some of its ill-gotten gains. I mean, that would be rewarding imperial genocidal aggression, which would be a terrible thing for European security, and would create a grey zone at the heart of our geopolitics, which would only bring war and chaos to us in future.
Do you think it's the nuclear element alone that scares or that concerns German Chancellor Olaf Scholz? Or is it the wider implications? Vladimir Putin recently alluded to the fact that if Russia fails in its war in Ukraine, that could mean the disintegration or the end of Russia.
Well, that's certainly not a fear I know that's shared in Poland or around Central Eastern Europe. The disintegration of Russia would be welcomed by many people. And indeed, as Russia is an empire, I think it's something we should be looking at in a very positive light. It would free the peoples who constitute the current Russian Federation. We shouldn't forget it is indeed a federation. How that federation was created is something more people should look at. But I think this does scare the German Chancellor, and it scares others in Germany too. And I think underlying that, there's something of that latent imperial mindset that still conditions some German decision-making. Great powers shouldn't lose wars in catastrophic ways because of the instability it could create. So, I mean, think of the German experience of 1918 there, which seems to be the driving force for this, rather than actually thinking about the German experience of 1945, where a comprehensive defeat liberated Germans as well as the rest of Europe from the Nazis.
Now, back to these meeting of foreign affairs ministers and, of course, the accession talks that are set to take place later on this week. Ukraine and Moldova are set to start these talks, but we have Hungary again stepping in, taking over the presidency of the Council of the European Union July 1st. So we're trying to hold these talks right before the Hungarian presidency. What's in the future for these talks? Are they to be resumed after July? Will they be put on hold? What are your thoughts?
It's an excellent question. I mean, the Hungarian presidency will do probably all it can to throw spanners in the works, but it doesn't control everything. It doesn't control all of the levers of power in that regard, and there will be immense pressure coming on from other sources, not least from the new commission when it gets going. And so who the new commissioner for enlargement is will send a signal about how serious a lot of the EU states are in pursuing this agenda at pace, which is what a lot of EU leaders have said is needed. We've even heard from Giorgia Meloni or Ulf Kristersson of Sweden centre-right and right politicians that this should really be a swift process for Ukraine and Moldova because, or especially for Ukraine, because of the geopolitical imperatives that are at the heart of this enlargement process. For others, we actually see obstacles in Berlin, for example, which is insisting on the correct process being followed on technocratic assessments, which doesn't really seem to meet the geopolitical moment. Has a tendency to throw obstacles ahead of the process, which again reflects an older way of thinking about enlargement. So I think there will be a lot of obstacles to this, but there's also a lot of political pressure in favor of continuing the talks and pushing them through swiftly. And we have seen in the last couple of years that when there is sufficient pressure and sufficient will, as well as the right people in place, then the EU can actually move on these things.
Where there's a will, there's definitely a way. Benjamin Tallis, thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate your very detailed and concise answers. Thank you, sir.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.